Thank you. I'm Chris with the permitting and siting for Class 6 wells, which are for long-term carbon dioxide storage. Thank you for putting this together. Next slide, please. The main challenges to permitting and siting. It's a complex array of regulating entities and related risk mitigation factors. So we covered reservoir characterization, pore space ownership, long-term liability, institutional inexperience, and some other related relevant issues and community opposition. Next slide, please. Okay, so the main challenge with reservoir characterization is building a robust data model. It's slow and expensive, and an official at the EPA related to us that it's the top evaluation criteria for the application. And this process can take up to 6 years, to give you a little background. The need is for volumetric, porosity, permeability, and containment properties that are suitable for storage permanence. And the characterization is similar to Class 1 wells, which are for waste injection, but it's far beyond Class 2 wells, which are for oil field injection. It requires safety and proximity data around groundwater acidification, which can lead to corrosion and health effects, fossil fuels, fault zones, and the effects on wildlife and proximity to civic infrastructure. So one of our solutions to bounce toward the end is looking at abandoned wells. They're close, maybe close to reservoirs. There's millions of them in the United States. And if they pierce the capstone, it hinders the confinement of CO2. A lot of these are old and there's a lack of closure information, which means that injectors bear the responsibility for capping and mitigating leakage. An oil field or an oil industry representative indicated that this can account for like half the cost of a CO2 injection project. Biden's infrastructure plan dedicates about $16 billion to capping abandoned wells. Our recommendation is to put prioritization not only on methane leaks, but on wells that are in close proximity to sequestration sites. And then another solution would be to have experienced well operators to obtain the permits and sell injection as a service to capturing facilities who receive the carbon credits. The carbon injector could also obtain transferable permits from those waste and enhanced oil recovery wells to speed up the process and to harden them for CO2 resilience. It's a recompletion. Oil company data is also available on inactive or less productive wells, and can be bought to enhance the data models. And you can market this data and sell specific site-specific data packages that go beyond broader regional data. Also, test wells, seismic surveys do not require EPA permits, are cheaper, and are a path to accelerating the process. So next up is Anca. Thanks.
Yes, hi everyone. So some of the other issues we looked at include pore space ownership. And here we're talking about the space in which where the CO2 will be stored underground. And one might think that if someone owns surface space, so landowners, they might also own what's underneath that. And that's not always the case, not in every state. So there is kind of a complex matrix of surface owners, subsurface or pore space owners that such a project would have to navigate. And it can be a roadblock given the fragmented rights that creates a complex situation. And essentially also because when you put CO2 underground, it potentially affects several landowners and several pore space owners. Negotiating with all of them might be very difficult, and you might have holdouts. So you might have people who are completely against it, although the majority could be for it. The other challenging issue here is that essentially CO2 migrates underground away from the well. So you're not sure exactly where the CO2 might be going or what proximity. So you might have to negotiate with even more parties, private parties. And essentially that makes large CO2 sequestration projects extremely challenging. Our recommendations here are essentially trying to simplify this complex matrix. So we would want to see stronger rules governing pore space access, and especially unitization, which in this case means, so if the majority of lease owners or a majority of leases go through, then that could potentially force holdouts to accept the project. So kind of as a strategy against these complex negotiations. As well as eminent domain. So eminent domain is essentially the ability of the government to take over land, to use it for public good. And we think in some cases for CCS, so for when we are really having a positive impact on the environment, that's potentially justified, of course, with compensation to the people who are affected. While at the same time, we do recognize that protecting property owners is very important, and we would want to build a very positive and maintain a very positive relationship with them. So to kind of counteract these maybe more kind of aggressive aggressive suggestions like the unitization and eminent domain, we think that they can only be really implemented while at the same time protecting the owners by essentially enforcing very strict monitoring rules. So if the CO2 leaks or something bad happens, that they're immediately compensated, and that doesn't cause a backlash against such a project. Another issue we looked at, and we've identified this as potentially the biggest concern or roadblock for a CCS project, is essentially liability, and especially long-term liability. And here, when we talk about liability, there are three kind of types of liability we should consider. Like there's civil liability in case there's any harm that's caused by the project. There's liability as CO2 might escape from underground, and then essentially the project becomes a CO2 emitter. So whatever that means from a regulation point of view, and also administrative liability. And what makes this very challenging is that a CCS project lifetime anyway is quite long, but the post-injection monitoring of the site, so making sure that the CO2 does not leak out or nothing else happens, that could be as long as 100 years. And this is hard to imagine as one person. Maybe for an entity is different, but still potentially can be very expensive. So the recommendations here that at some point we think, especially if the government wants CCS projects to develop, that they accept a transfer of liability at some point in the project. So potentially after the well is stable and injection has been going on for a while. So we want to see the capping of risk and liability and the cost to operators. Also to make this more competitive, so other countries do this, and to make that transfer that can add a competitive edge. Also share financial burden, as I said. So I think liability can be extremely expensive to cover with insurance, and they're not like specialized products yet for this. So we think this could be a game changer if something along the lines of a transfer to government can occur. Also, the challenge with the second kind of liability I mentioned of CO2 emissions is that, we get a financial gain today with a certain price from 45Q and LCFS, but if the CO2 escapes in 25 years, who knows what the price of CO2 at that point might be. So you might be actually paying way more in 25 years for 10% of the CO2 leaking than you paid for 10%, or what you got for 10% of the CO2 you've buried today. So we think that could be, that needs to be addressed in this liability transfer and capping. And also to tie the financial security to a stewardship fund, like it exists in other places. So we think there's other examples to follow. And I will transition to the next slide for Alex.
So one permitting issue that came up repeatedly in our conversations was due to the fact that Class 6 wells are a relatively new category. They were only established in 2010. There's only a half dozen or so of them that have gone through the whole permitting process. And what this means is that regulators really haven't, at least at the federal level, regulators really haven't had a lot of opportunities to sort of finesse their review process. There's no precedent for them to rely on. Every decision they make is setting a new precedent. So they're being very deliberative and taking their time. And on the other side, applicants for a Class 6 well permit also haven't gone through the process. There's no really good examples of what a successful permit application looks like for them to follow. There are really no experts or consultants or advisors because so few people have gone through this process. So you're left with a slow, expensive process, which produces a sort of vicious cycle. It's slow and expensive. So developers, it's not very attractive to developers. Developers don't want to submit applications. Therefore, the regulators aren't processing applications. They're not really honing their process or gaining confidence. And the process continues to be slow and expensive. Our top recommendation for dealing with this is to introduce public funds, to inject those into the system through public-private partnerships, through publicly funded demonstration projects and pilot programs, things like that, which on the one hand will alleviate some of the financial burden and some of the risk on developers who are applying for these permits. So it'll make those permits more attractive inherently. And on the other hand, will also create a pipeline of projects that will give regulators the opportunity to set precedent and gain confidence and know what they're looking for and what they're not looking for in this process. Next slide, please. So community opposition is a really effective, communities have very effective tools to prevent projects if they don't want a project in their community. Citizens referendums, litigation, political issues. These can make projects extremely expensive and delay them almost indefinitely for developers. So one recommendation we have for developers is that they should really solicit invitations from communities. There are plenty of reservoirs in the United States that are appropriate for sequestration. Some of those reservoirs will have communities that would really embrace the economic stimulus of a large infrastructure project. We think that that's a sort of a match made in heaven for developers and communities. They will be welcomed there as a guest rather than sort of shoehorning themselves into a community as an unwanted interloper. So next slide. I just want to thank my team. We had a really outstanding team. We did a lot of work that I'm really proud of in the last 3 weeks. We didn't cover everything. It's a huge topic, but we would love to talk more to people. If you have any expertise in this area, we're always looking to learn more, and there are some other subjects we dabbled in that we would love to share our knowledge about.